There was a time when the world trusted that diplomacy, real, honest, face-to-face diplomacy, could pull two nations back from the edge, that even the most stubborn conflicts had a moment where both sides paused, looked at each other, and chose the harder but wiser road. That time feels very far away tonight, because just 1 hour ago, something happened. Something that did not make the front page of the newspapers yet. Something that most evening news anchors have not fully processed. Something that by tomorrow morning is going to change the entire conversation about where this conflict is headed. Iran said no, not with diplomatic softness, not with the kind of polite language that still leaves a window cracked open. Iran looked at the negotiating table that Washington had spent weeks preparing, a table that required the cooperation of 3 different mediating governments, back-channel messages passed through diplomats in countries most people cannot find on a map, and the very last reserves of American credibility in the region, and refused to sit down. No confirmation, no counteroffer, no alternative date, just a refusal dressed up in careful language that still meant exactly one thing: we are not coming. And here is what makes this moment so important to understand. Just 72 hours ago, senior American officials were privately telling trusted journalists that a real breakthrough was possible. Not certain, not guaranteed, but possible in a way it had not been at any earlier point in the last 6 weeks. The word progress was being used quietly, carefully, by people who do not use that word unless they mean it. That word is now gone. What we are watching tonight is not just a diplomatic failure. It is the beginning of a strategy coming apart. And when strategies come apart at this level, between nuclear-capable nations in one of the most economically sensitive regions on the planet, the consequences do not stay inside conference rooms. They move into markets. They move into military command centers. They move into the daily lives of ordinary people who never asked to be part of any of this. If you want to understand what is really happening, not the talking points, not the spin, but the actual story unfolding behind these headlines, please like this video right now and subscribe to this channel, because the next 48 hours are going to move fast, and the people who understand the full picture will be the ones best prepared for what comes next. To truly understand what happened today, you cannot start with today. You have to go back. Because every crisis that looks sudden from the outside has been building slowly on the inside for a long time. And this one is no different. Let us start with the blockade. On April 12th, the United States announced a full naval blockade of Iranian ports. The official explanation was straightforward: maximum pressure precisely applied, cut off Iran's ability to export oil, strangle the revenue that funds its military, make the economic pain so significant, so unavoidable, so deeply felt in every corner of Iranian society that the Iranian government would eventually have to choose between the pride of resistance and the survival of its own people. The architects of that strategy were confident. They had economic models showing Iran's foreign currency reserves depleting within weeks. They had projections on inflation, on unemployment, on the kind of social pressure that eventually forces governments to make decisions they did not want to make. Everything looked clean on paper. Everything looked logical. Everything made sense in the way that things often make sense before they meet the complicated, unpredictable reality of actual human beings. What the models could not measure was this: what happens to a proud nation's psychology when it feels it is being publicly humiliated? Because that is what the blockade felt like from Tehran, not a negotiating tool, not a measured application of pressure. It felt like a foot on a throat. And when people feel a foot on their throat, they do not typically respond by asking politely for the foot to be removed. They fight, or they dig in, or they hand power to the people inside their own system who are always arguing for exactly that kind of response. That is precisely what happened inside Iran. Now let me introduce you to the most important character in this story, a man who barely gets mentioned in Western coverage, and whose situation explains almost everything happening today. His name is Masoud Pezeshkian. He is Iran's elected president, and for the past 6 weeks, he has been fighting one of the loneliest battles in international politics, trying to argue from inside a government that does not fully listen to him, that negotiation is not surrender, that talking to Washington is not weakness, and that the economic damage being absorbed by ordinary Iranian families is real, urgent, and does not care about ideology. Pezeshkian has seen the numbers. Iran's currency had already lost more than a third of its value before the blockade even began. Bread prices in Tehran jumped nearly 60% in 6 weeks. Families that were managing, not comfortably, but managing, are now making choices between food and medicine. He knows this. He has been saying this. And he has been losing the internal argument almost every single week because Pezeshkian does not control the IRGC. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is Iran's parallel military force. It does not answer to the elected president. It does not answer to the foreign ministry. It answers to the supreme leader through its own chain of command, and its commanders leaders have a completely different reading of the situation. They are not looking at bread prices. They are not calculating currency reserves. They are calculating something much older and to them much more important, the price of being seen to submit. In their worldview, every concession made under American military pressure is not a step toward peace. It is a step toward irrelevance. And irrelevance for an institution like the IRGC is an existential threat. So here is the situation as of this morning. You have an elected president desperately trying to open a door to dialogue. You have a parallel military force actively working to keep that door shut. You have a supreme leader sitting between them, receiving arguments from both sides, and making decisions that do not always follow a pattern that Western analysts can easily predict. And into that extraordinarily delicate internal balance, Washington fires a statement today using the phrase serious violation and reminding everyone that all options remain on the table. We will come back to that decision in a moment. But first, let us talk about what actually happened this morning, step by step, because the details matter. Before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell us, were you following this conflict before today, or is this the first time you're really getting the full picture? We read every comment, and your perspective genuinely shapes the conversations we have on this channel. This morning did not begin with one bad event. It began with 3 bad events happening almost simultaneously, each one feeding into the others, each one making the overall situation harder to resolve, like 3 separate fires breaking out in the same building at the same time. The first crisis, Iran's refusal. At approximately 9:15 in the morning, Iran's foreign ministry issued a statement. It was carefully worded. It did not use aggressive language. It did not declare talks dead or issue any kind of dramatic ultimatum. But what it said was, or more precisely, what it declined to say was unmistakable to anyone who follows these situations closely. Iran would not confirm participation in the next round of indirect talks scheduled for later this week. Not we are withdrawing, not talks are over, just we are not confirming we will be there. In the language of international diplomacy, that is not a neutral position when a delegation has already begun traveling, when mediating governments have already booked meeting rooms and arranged security details and coordinated the logistical complexity of bringing 2 hostile parties close enough to talk without being seen talking. In that context, refusing to confirm attendance is functionally the same as refusing to attend. The American delegation that had been preparing for days suddenly found itself in an impossible position. You cannot send senior officials halfway around the world to sit across from an empty chair. The optics alone would be devastating. So within hours, there were frantic back-channel communications, messages sent through the Omani channel, messages sent through the Qatari channel, messages sent through a European diplomatic track that had been quietly operating for 3 weeks without any public acknowledgement. All of them met the same response from Tehran: silence, or something close enough to silence that it did not matter. The second crisis, Washington's response made everything worse. Here is where the story takes a turn that genuinely needs to be examined closely, because this is the moment where a difficult situation became a dangerous one. Within 4 hours of Iran's statement becoming public, the White House issued its own response. And the tone of that response was harder, sharper, and more aggressive than anything we had heard from Washington in the previous 2 weeks. Officials described Iran's behavior under the ceasefire as a serious violation. They used the phrase, all options remain on the table, not once, but twice in the same official statement. They spoke about Iran in language that sounded less like a government trying to bring a reluctant partner back to a negotiating table and more like a government preparing its domestic audience for the possibility that talking is about to stop entirely. Now, step back from the Washington perspective for a moment and think about what that statement looks like from inside Tehran. Pezeshkian, the pragmatist, the man who has been arguing for dialogue, the man who has been losing internal battles week after week but who has not given up, woke up this morning and was already in a difficult position. The IRGC hardliners were using Iran's economic pain not as an argument for negotiation, but as proof that Washington could never be trusted. That pain was proof of American hostility. That pain was reason to resist, not reason to talk. And then Washington issued that statement. In 4 hours, the hardliners went from making an argument to winning an argument, because now they could stand up in whatever room these internal debates happen and say exactly what they had always said. Look, the moment we showed even a hint of flexibility, they escalated. The moment the pressure eased slightly, they pushed harder. This is not a negotiation. This is a slow-motion demand for unconditional surrender, and we do not accept that. Pezeshkian lost another internal argument today. He has been losing them one by one for 6 weeks, and each one he loses pulls Iran one step further from the table and one step closer to the position where the hardliners are the only ones left with any influence over what happens next. The third crisis, The battlefield does not wait for diplomacy. While all of this was playing out in press statements and private communications, the physical situation on the ground was not standing still. It never does. That is one of the oldest and most painful lessons of any conflict. The battlefield does not pause because diplomats are talking. The guns do not go quiet because there is a ceasefire that has not yet formally expired. Strikes were reported in at least 2 locations in the broader region on the same morning that Tehran issued its refusal. These were not accidents and they were not coincidences. In conflict zones, when the diplomatic track stalls, the military track fills the silence automatically. It is not a decision anyone makes consciously. It is simply what happens when the framework holding things together develops a visible crack. Every actor in the region, every faction, every commander with an agenda and an opportunity begins to move. The energy markets understood all of this within minutes. Brent crude jumped $6.40 a barrel in less than 90 minutes after Iran's statement went public. Asian liquefied natural gas contracts spiked sharply. War risk insurance premiums for commercial vessels transiting the Gulf, which had been slowly, carefully declining over the past week as cautious optimism about talks had built, reversed completely in a single morning session. Not ticked up, reversed completely. And here is why that matters for people watching this who are not traders and do not follow energy markets. When insurance premiums spike that fast, shipping companies make a very practical decision. They stop sending ships, not because they want to, not because of politics, because the math stops working. And when ships stop moving through a corridor that carries roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply, the consequences do not stay in the region. They spread. They reach the gas stations and the heating bills and the grocery store prices of people in countries that have nothing to do with this conflict and did not ask to be affected by it. That is the third crisis. And it is in some ways the most quietly devastating of the 3 because it moves slowly enough that most people do not notice it happening until it has already arrived. Now let us talk about the clock. Because there is something in this situation that is not being discussed enough in the mainstream coverage, and it is the single most important structural fact of the next 2 weeks. The ceasefire has an expiration date. It was never designed to be permanent. Both sides understood it as a bridge, a temporary pause in active fighting that was supposed to create space for a more formal and durable agreement to be negotiated. The bridge was supposed to lead somewhere, but bridges only hold when both sides are building toward the same destination. And right now, one side has stopped laying planks. When a ceasefire expires and nothing has replaced it, you do not return to the situation that existed before the ceasefire began. You return to something categorically worse. Because during the ceasefire, both sides have been doing what militaries always do during pauses: repositioning, resupplying, updating battle plans, hardening positions. The guns went quiet. The preparations did not. If the diplomatic track cannot be restarted before the ceasefire window closes, what follows will be harder to contain than what came before. That is not speculation. That is the consistent lesson of every ceasefire collapse in modern history. And as of 1 hour ago, nobody with the power to stop that clock has shown any credible sign that they know how to stop it. But here is where the story turns. And I want you to pay close attention to this part because it is the part that almost no one is reporting. And it is the part that might actually matter most for what happens next. Buried deep inside the coverage of today's events, not in the American press, not in the European outlets, but in a regional publication that covers Iranian political affairs closely and has sources inside the foreign ministry, there was a single quote from an Iranian diplomatic official, not Pezeshkian himself, not the foreign minister, a mid-level official who has been involved in the back-channel communications throughout this process. This official said there has been movement, but movement is not arrival. Read that again. Movement is not arrival. That is not the language of a side that has permanently closed the door. That is the language of a side that is exhausted, that is under enormous internal pressure, that is being pulled in opposite directions by competing factions within its own government, but that is still, somehow, despite everything, leaving a crack in the door. Iran did not say talks are finished. Iran said talks are not confirmed. In normal circumstances, that might be the same thing. In these circumstances, given the internal battle happening inside Tehran right now, it is a meaningful distinction, because what is really happening inside the Iranian government today is not a united front of defiance. It is a war, a quiet, internal, intensely political war between 2 fundamentally different visions of how Iran survives this moment. The pragmatists, Pezeshkian's camp, sections of the foreign ministry, parts of the business community, and clerical establishment that understand economic reality, they have not given up. They are wounded. They have lost a string of internal arguments. They woke up this morning to a Washington statement that handed their opponents the best ammunition they have had in weeks. But they have not surrendered. They are still in the room. They are still making the argument that a deal, even an imperfect deal, even a deal that requires difficult concessions, is better than a war that Iran cannot win and a blockade that Iran cannot outlast indefinitely. The hardliners are winning right now. But winning an internal argument in a government is not the same as winning permanently, because the economic reality does not care about ideology. Currency reserves do not replenish themselves because of revolutionary principle. Families who cannot afford bread do not remain patient indefinitely because their government tells them that resistance is a matter of national honor. The pressure that was supposed to change Iran's external behavior is actually doing something different. It is changing Iran's internal politics. Slowly, painfully, in ways that are unpredictable, but it is doing it. And there will come a point, and that point may be closer than anyone publicly admits, where the weight of that internal pressure becomes impossible for even the hardliners to ignore. The real turnaround in this story is not going to be announced at a press conference. It is not going to come with a dramatic headline or a handshake photograph. It is going to come quietly through a channel that neither side publicly acknowledges, in language that both sides can claim was their idea. That is how these things have always ended throughout history, not with one side winning and the other side losing, but with both sides finding a version of events they can live with. The only question that matters right now is whether there is enough time before the ceasefire expires for that quiet turnaround to happen, and whether the people making decisions in Washington understand that today's aggressive tone may have just shortened the window they are working with. Washington made a serious strategic error this morning, not in maintaining pressure. Pressure has its place in diplomacy, and removing it entirely in response to Iran's refusal would have sent the wrong message to every other actor watching this situation. The error was in the specific words chosen and the specific moment they were chosen. When you are trying to give a pragmatist like Pezeshkian the internal political room to make the argument for dialogue inside his own government, you do not publicly humiliate his country on the same morning his opponents are already winning the argument. You have just given those opponents a gift they did not earn and did not deserve. This is not a small mistake. In diplomacy, timing and tone are not secondary considerations. They are the strategy. And today the strategy failed. So let us step back from the specific events of today and ask the bigger question. The question that history always eventually forces us to ask, no matter how complicated the politics get, no matter how many factions and frameworks and ceasefire expiration dates are involved. What is this actually about? At its core, this is a story about the limits of force, not the limits of military power. That is a different conversation. The limits of force as a tool for changing what people believe, what they value, and how much pain they are willing to absorb in defense of their dignity. There is a lesson that the 20th century tried to teach us many times, and that we keep relearning in each new generation because it runs against something deep in human nature. The instinct that says if you apply enough pressure, people will eventually break. Sometimes they do break. History is full of examples. But history is equally full of examples where pressure did the opposite, where the more you squeezed, the harder people held on, where the economic pain that was supposed to produce compliance instead produced a population that rallied around its government simply because accepting outside pressure felt worse than suffering together. Iran in 2025 and 2026 is not a simple case of a government versus its people. It is a government that contains within it the full spectrum of human response to crisis. Pragmatists and hardliners, realists and ideologues, people who want peace and people who have built their entire identity around resistance. And the strategy of maximum external pressure, whatever its other merits, has consistently strengthened the voices least interested in compromise and weakened the voices most capable of making one. That is not a political opinion. That is an observation about what has measurably happened inside Iranian domestic politics over the last 6 weeks. Here is what a wiser path looks like. Not a weaker path, not a path of appeasement, but a genuinely wiser one. It looks like understanding the difference between pressuring a government and humiliating a people. Those two things feel similar from the outside. They are completely different in their effects. You can pressure a government into making a calculation. You cannot humiliate a people into choosing goodwill. You only deepen the wound that future negotiations will have to heal. It looks like recognizing that Pezeshkian and the pragmatists inside the Iranian system are not enemies. They are the only viable path to an agreement that lasts longer than the next ceasefire window. Every time Washington says something that weakens their internal position, Washington is not winning a point against Iran. It is losing ground toward its own stated objective. It looks like understanding that the allies who are quietly stepping back to Canada, Germany, the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, are not doing so because they have given up on the United States. They are doing so because they can see a strategy that is producing the opposite of its intended results, and they do not want to be attached to the consequences when it fully unravels. And perhaps most importantly, it looks like remembering what diplomacy is actually for. Diplomacy is not a reward for good behavior. It is a tool for managing situations where force alone cannot produce a durable outcome. It is the recognition, hard-won, sometimes humbling, that the world is full of nations with their own histories, their own dignities, their own internal politics that outsiders cannot fully control, and that the only path to stability is finding arrangements that acknowledge those realities, rather than pretending they do not exist. There is a generation of people who remember a time when American diplomacy understood this, when the goal was not to be seen winning every public exchange, but to actually achieve outcomes that lasted. That kind of patience, like strategic, disciplined, focused on the end result rather than the daily headline, has not been visible in Washington's approach to this crisis. And the cost of that absence is becoming clearer every single day. For the ordinary people living inside all of this, the Iranian family watching their savings evaporate, the oil worker in the Gulf wondering if his port will still be operating in 3 months, the pensioner in Germany opening an energy bill that has doubled since this conflict began, the truck driver in South Korea filling up his tank at a price nobody budgeted for. None of this was their choice. None of this reflects their values or their wishes. And yet, as always in these situations, they are the ones absorbing the sharpest edge of decisions made by people they have never met, in rooms they will never see, about interests they were never asked about. That is the oldest injustice in international affairs, and it does not have a clean resolution. But understanding it honestly, naming it clearly, refusing to pretend that the human cost of these decisions is an acceptable abstraction, is the beginning of demanding something better. The talks did not collapse today, but they stopped holding things together. And when that thin layer of diplomatic progress disappears, when the framework that was barely keeping the worst-case scenario at bay no longer has enough weight behind it to do its job, everything underneath starts moving again. History will look back at this week. It will ask whether the people who had the power to choose a different path understood what was at stake clearly enough to choose it in time. That question does not have an answer yet. The answer is still being written. In back-channel messages, in ceasefire clocks that are still ticking, in the quiet decisions of pragmatists inside Tehran who have not yet given up but who are running out of room to keep trying. We will be watching every development, every signal, every moment where the story could still turn in a different direction. If this kind of honest, patient, clear analysis is what you come here for, please subscribe to this channel and like this video. Share it with someone in your life who deserves to understand what is actually happening beyond the surface of the headlines. The more people who see the full picture, the harder it becomes for anyone, on any side, to hide behind half the story. Stay informed, stay thoughtful, and never stop asking the harder questions.